Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Emily Evans from the Women's Foundation of Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the EcoTrust building in Northwest Portland, where thousands of people are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening via X-Ray FM station 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program on community media television. We're incredibly grateful for the support of our media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs. A special thank you goes to the EcoTrust building for working with us to bring Friday Forum to this space. EcoTrust is a nonprofit organization based right here in this building, working for an equitable, prosperous, and climate-smart future. EcoTrust believes in the power of convening people around great ideas. And the organization operates two historically rooted, forward-thinking Portland gathering spaces, the Red on Salmon Street on the east side, and this building, the Natural Capital Center. When you host an event in one of these buildings, your dollars go to support their work to create environmental well-being, economic opportunity, and social equity in this place we call home. Thank you also to Tamale Boy for the wonderful food, right? Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who made this event possible. We also want to do a very quick plug to remind everyone to fill out the census. Yay! You count and make sure to make that count. So 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which finally placed women's right to vote in the United States Constitution. Oregon was one of several Western states that saw early victories in this area. How has the women's vote impacted Oregon over the last 100 years? What barriers remain? In celebration and reflection of this historic anniversary, we have a wonderful panel of scholars, historians, and changemakers here with us today. With us are Shadiin Garcia, Executive Director of the Educator Advancement Council, Eliza Canty-Jones, editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly and Director of Community Engagement at the Oregon Historical Society, and Dr. Shirley A. Jackson, Professor in the Department of Black Studies at Portland State University. Please join me in welcoming today's panelists. So let's start out with a sort of quick thumbnail sketch of the history of women's suffrage in Oregon. Helpfully, Eliza just finished curating an upcoming show on this topic. It's called Nevertheless, They Persisted, and it'll be at the Oregon Historical Society starting in March. So Eliza, would you mind painting us a sort of quick picture of suffrage in Oregon, and then Shadiin and Shirley can chime in if there are points they want to emphasize or round out as we set the stage.
Sure, but I probably won't do that in 1 minute, but I'll do my best. And I should say that the Nevertheless, They Persisted was curated by my wonderful colleague, Lori Erickson, with the work of many, many advisors, including Dr. Jackson, so thanks very much. When we think about the history of suffrage and voting rights in Oregon history, it's bound up in state history, it's bound up in national history. We're thinking about citizenship, we're thinking about laws, we're thinking about what's legal and then what's happening outside the bounds of laws, right? So in 1857, a group of white men gathered in Salem to write an Oregon state constitution. They restricted voting just to white men in that document, which the United States Congress ratified in 1859. And so we became a state initially with one of the most exclusive constitutions in the country, and you can learn more about that. Oregon women began organizing for suffrage in 1871, which was just 1 year after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which granted suffrage to black men who had just worked for and earned their freedom through the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment and other actions. Of course, black men and women and white women and other folks had been advancing the cause of women's suffrage and equal suffrage for black folks for a long time before that. But we see the first organized women's suffrage movements happening in the early 1870s, a visit from Abigail Scott Duniway, a 2,000-mile trip with, Abigail Scott Duniway was already here. Susan B. Anthony came to visit, and she and Abigail Scott Duniway went on a 2,000-mile trip around the Pacific Northwest. And the formal fight for women's suffrage began then, extended through 1912 and 1920. After 5 unsuccessful efforts, in 1912, Oregon women won the right to vote. And then, of course, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. And Oregon, as a state, was one of the states that ratified the 19th Amendment, unlike the 15th Amendment. Because women already had the right to vote in Oregon by that time, there was an Oregon woman in the Oregon State Legislature who was able to put forth that legislation in a special session for ratification, which is pretty cool. And Oregon women who continued to fight for the 19th Amendment, including being arrested and protesting in Washington, D.C., and all of that. That's not really the end of suffrage history for women in Oregon, because even though legally all women gained the right to vote, all women who were citizens in 1912 and 1920, realistically, it was not till passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that we saw really the kinds of necessary changes to remove restrictions to the ballot for all kinds of folks. And then there were amendments to that in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, as we all remember, in 2013, the Supreme Court then took a lot of the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act. So it's really a history of advances and fallbacks and a lot of organizing and cooperation and conflict in this history. So I'll stop with that for now.
Sure, just a Coatzi, Tehename Shadiin, Sina Hanusta. Hello, my name is Shadiin Garcia. I am Chicana and Laguna Pueblo from New Mexico. I've been in Oregon for about 16 years now. While we talk about the rights of women to vote through the 19th Amendment, Native Americans didn't receive citizenship until 1924, and it wasn't all Native Americans that got citizenship. So we have to be careful when we think about our pronouns. We have to be careful when we think about all women. And what does that mean? It means that we need to look at ourselves and rethink what we opened with, which was a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement is actually not something that's a part of a past. It reminds ourselves to be in right relationship with the truth of the state and the truth of what it means to be on stolen ground. And that's to acknowledge that we weren't even considered people, one. And two, it's when we talk about constitution, we need to be talking about constitutions. When we talk about nation, we need to talk about nations. There are 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon. And so when we think about the landscape, that has to be the forefront in order for us to do right, to be in right relation with the land.
I want to mention something that Eliza said about the gap, if you will, in who can vote or who could vote, especially with the 15th Amendment not even being ratified by the state of Oregon. And to think about what that means to then have Black women as part of the struggle for the right for women to vote in Oregon. So it's a very complicated issue that you have where there's that intersection of race and gender that constantly seems to play a role for those women who are, behind the scenes in a number of ways, and even as women had to deal with the racism of the women who were working for the right to vote. So we can't really ignore that complication that existed for Black women.
And I'll just speak to that a little bit because it's something we think about a lot, and I appreciate both of these comments so much. And one of the things that I've been educated a lot about in my work is thinking about the difference between the rights of indigenous people and the rights of other folks of color in the United States, because we're talking about civil rights and sovereign rights, as I'm understanding it. And so at the same time as all this is going on, and there are a lot of folks advocating for the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, there's also a lot of work by state and federal governments to destroy sovereignty that Native leaders protected. Well, how do I say this right? What I want to say is that Native leaders protected within the bounds of United States law through treaties, but of course didn't need those treaties to establish their own sovereignty and relationship. I'll say it a little bit that way you can correct me, hopefully. But I'll say, as Dr. Jackson is pointing out, that there were, Oregon did not ratify the 15th Amendment. A lot of folks know about the exclusionary clauses that were in the Oregon State Constitution, banned slavery and banned Black people. At the same time, Black men and women were leaders in the state. So in 1870, after the 15th Amendment was ratified, George P. Riley printed up a big
had an event. He was quoted as an eloquent speaker who was going to speak on, quote, the colored citizen and the ballot at the Philharmonic Hall. So the folks who were here were resilient and demonstrating their leadership in spite of all of these kinds of oppressions that were happening anyway. And so for us, trying to hold all of that together is a big part of how we're trying to understand this history.
And we're talking about, for the black population, in 1900, I believe it was, there were less than 1,000 African Americans in the state. And to have individuals who are pushing for certain kinds of rights, I think is very notable. But I think it also speaks to the difficulty of doing so in a place where you really were not welcome. And to think about what it means for black women to not be welcome as black, but then also to not be welcome in this struggle for women's suffrage.
I'm really interested in teasing out the distinctions between a legal right, the genuine access that allows folks to exercise that right, and the ongoing practice of exercising that right. So once the legal right to vote was technically granted to women in Oregon, what barriers to access and full participation remained, both by community and other barriers, and then which of them remain still? Sort of like, what's the playbook then? What's the playbook now? How do we see these through lines coming throughout the decades that followed?
I guess I'd start with, again, by reiterating, not all women got the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. And to think about, I don't know if playbook is the right term, and I don't know that I have the right term in terms of legality. In terms of Indigenous people, what it means to enact, embody, and be our sovereign selves, as our most empowered selves, in the face of pretty solid, brutal erasure and oppression, particularly in the context of women. I think it requires that we sit in the knowledge and understanding that about 84% of women, Native American, American Indian women, experience violence. We're raped 1 in 3. 1 in 3. 1 in 3. We experience suicide at rates 3.5 times higher than any other group. And it's because of the purposeful, intentional playbook of erasure. And so I have a hard time trying to find a clear through line. We haven't even begin to speak about what that intersectionality means, like in communities where you're Black and Indian, right, where you're Latino and Indian, and what that means. And we talk about resilience, which I think matters, but I think it gets framed as, look how much you've done to overcome, and grit, and that actually undermines the actual concept of survivance, of lived experience through, again, being in right relationship with land and what sovereignty means. So I don't know that playbook is, like, I hear what you're asking and I struggle to find the term. I struggle to find the through line in the context of what the strategy concept of playbook is. So I don't know if I answered that.
Just respond to that a little bit. I really appreciate the use of the word erasure. In the historic academic field, we often talk about assimilation and all of the assimilation policies of the federal government. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, a lot of those policies were ongoing theft of native land through various laws and that kind of thing, the theft of native children into boarding schools, the theft of culture and language, all of that kind of thing. So, and I think erasure is a good word for that. And so all of what you were just talking about are the realities of today. When we think about the barriers that can be put into place for voting, right? So if you think about a voter ID law, what does it take to get an ID? It takes money. It takes enough safety and security in your life to be able to get to the DMV or wherever it is to get it, right? This is just to exercise the very baseline of engagement in a self-ruled society, right? So if we think about all the ways that white supremacy enacts onto various populations and the ways that those enactments can get in the way of access to whatever is needed to register to vote and to get to a vote, I think you get to a much bigger picture of how that can happen. We can look at specific examples like a North Dakota law that said your ID to be able to vote had to have a street address, which a lot of reservation residences don't have. That's explicitly targeted at Indigenous folks living on a reservation without actually having to say it. Now, there's been court fights and people have won on that, but those are the kinds of things that we continue to see. In Oregon in 1924, close to 80% of Oregon voters voted to enact a literacy test, so that voters then had to be able to demonstrate their ability to read English to be able to get their access to the ballot. That, my understanding is, was not overruled until it was made illegal through an expansion of the Voting Rights Act in the later 20th century. And that's an anti-immigrant policy. So when you're looking at all of the barriers to the vote, right, what you're looking at is the barriers to access to power in a democratic society. So there's a lot of them. And from some of the reading that I've done, my understanding is we may see this happening differently today, that there may be one political party who's enacting these barriers a lot more than another. That's new. The desire to restrict access to voting is not something that has been the purview of one political party, historically speaking. So there's just, the playbook is big, and it's connected to a lot of these other systems as well.
And one of those is social class. So if you think about, some of the things that you said, these are things that if you ignore the importance of social class, then you're ignoring the impact of the ability to participate in decisions that directly affect you. You're being sort of, this is where erasure does come in, in terms of being erased based on one social class. You are not in that category of people who have the ability to vote, who have the ability to ensure that there are laws in place that help benefit them. So if you are looking at, getting rid of the voices of those people who may be, a nuisance, if you will, and here I also think about not only social class, but let's look at the right for women to vote. The number of campaigns that were led that were anti-woman suffrage campaigns. So the fact that you have all of these types of barriers that are prohibiting or that are meant to prohibit access to political power and political representation by people, for people who are of certain categories. I think we are talking so many more people than any of us could even really imagine.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, coming to you from the EcoTrust building in Northwest Portland. I'm Emily Evans of the Women's Foundation of Oregon, and with us today are Shadiin Garcia, Executive Director of the Educator Advancement Council, Eliza Canty-Jones from the Oregon Historical Society, and Dr. Shirley A. Jackson from the PSU Black Studies Department. And we're discussing the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So I'm interested in the sort of problematic premises that were granted when pursuit of suffrage itself became the goal. I'm thinking of this particularly in the queer rights movement in recent years has been marked by really strong desire to have access to the institution of marriage and the military, which tend to be some of the most conservative, oppressive structures that we have. And so it's interesting to me to reflect on the premises that are granted about the validity and the importance of those institutions just by the pursuit of them, the centrality of the pursuit of them in a broader movement for liberation. So I'm really interested in when suffrage sort of became the goal, and it became the goal specifically for white women to the exclusion of many other groups, including black men, what were we saying was valid about that goal, and what, upon reflection, do we think may have been problematic with that?
I don't know, I'm thinking it through as you're saying it. I think it grants a premise of exclusion right out of the gate when we center what it means to define citizenship and community and land. So I think, I'm not answering it, but when we center suffrage in the way it was, or when folks center suffrage in the way it was centered, I think we grant some premises that we have not begun to deconstruct in a way that we should.
I think about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and how important that particular amendment has been in the past and in the present. So if you are trying to make an argument that a particular group should not have access to something, but you have no clear argument that can supersede, if you will, the intent of the Equal Protection Clause, to me, it's, and I think it's actually something that has been useful in a lot of the debates, such as marriage, you know, and how marriage actually applies to so many people, not just simply a man and a woman, and not simply to somebody who happens to be of the same race, because those battles have also been dealt with in the courts. You know, for example, there are a number of court cases where you have Black women who are arguing with the court that they are legally married to the person that they were married to, but yet if that person didn't want to pay alimony, what they could do is say, well, you know, she tricked me. She's not really, she said she was something else. Oh, I didn't know she was Black. Because that would invalidate that marriage. And there are a couple of really interesting cases, and one of them actually involves a hairdresser as an expert witness. No comment. Anyway, I think it's useful to think about the way in which certain parts of the Constitution were at the time perhaps perceived to apply to a particular group, but then how useful those arguments they come in handy when you're trying to make a case for other things. And I think that actually shows the power, if you will, of certain constitutional amendments. But I think it also is important to note which of those constitutional amendments are constantly being argued against, and where do you have the butting of heads? Where do you have people who are in the process of trying to argue against having certain rights afforded to a group of people? And if we look at, again, the right to vote, we take a lot of this for granted. I don't take it for granted, but I know that I'm somebody who understands my history as an African American. What it meant for me to vote the first time meant this is something that my ancestors really struggled to win for me, and it's something that I do every single year. It doesn't matter where I live. I believe it's actually very important to participate in that process, but we have to recall those instances of those groups where that has not been so easy. It is a constant battle, and it is something that for some groups there are efforts to make sure that this is not something that you retain.
I think the very fact that there has been such a long and diverse and sustained campaign to restrict voting rights to a smaller group of people indicates the power that voting does have, right? If it wasn't an act that brought about some level of power and influence, then people wouldn't fight so hard to restrict it. That said, I really understand the premise of the question, which I take to be sort of, okay, but are we sort of accepting a certain kind of power of the state, generally speaking, by asking for the vote instead of asking for something else entirely, right? Is that sort of what you're saying? And I think that is also a question worth asking. So both of these things are true, right? That it's a powerful tool, it's one that people have used and continue to use to advance real and significant change. And if we consider it the only way that we figure out how we are organized as a society or how we advance the changes we want, then we're going to miss seeing something that's outside of the possibility that is constrained within the system we have, right? So when I hear people talking about if we're thinking about how is our society in right relationship with the land, right? How are we in right relationship with each other? Is that a question that our governmental systems are asking? And if not, is that a question we can push our governmental systems to ask, or is that a question that we need to go outside of them to ask? And where does the vote fall in that? So does asking for a vote narrow our view, or can we see it as one tactic in broader work?
Sovereignty means not asking. We're granting a premise that we're asking, and that we're playing in a system that's designed to erase and destroy based on greed and land. Sovereignty means you make manifest your relation with the land and your ancestors and your future without asking.
I'm also really interested in this sort of non-linear path to suffrage, specifically how many losses and setbacks and ongoing struggles were a part of the journey for different groups at different times. In Oregon here, it took 6 times to pass suffrage, more than in any other state. In other Western states like Utah and Washington, white women gained the right to vote and then lost it for a period of time and then regained it. And so I'm curious about how this level of like setback, failure, winding road, and ongoing journey compares with other anti-oppression movements, and whether or not we see, frankly, the level of outrage and continued push for progress that we need to see when we see voter suppression efforts or de-enrollment, voter ID laws, anything that is actively interfering with the right to vote now, which is real and ongoing for underrepresented groups.
I think it's a part of it has to do with trying to keep people in their place. If you think about having the right to vote for women being this very bumpy road, or this road where you have, you think you know the direction, and then somebody sends you on another path and you now have to start from where you began, and it's a very difficult path. I think if you consider the way in which we see this so often, I'm going to give the example of the right to vote as it pertained to the struggle for suffrage in the southern United States. You have a group of white women who have all of this support, for white women primarily, but there are also black women who are participating as well. When these marches were taking place in the southern United States, you had white women asking black women to sort of make themselves scarce, if you will, or to not participate in marches in the South for fear that it would offend white women. So there is that problem of racism that was there, but it's like, well, let's just ignore this issue of racism because it's all about women getting the right to vote. Well, what about black women? And the fact that you would have women who would say, well, we just don't want to offend these women over here. With the suffrage movement, you also had men who were fearful that women were going to become men or become, men-like, in the sense that you've got pictures of little girls who are putting on pants, or you have the fear that women are suddenly going to be so independent that you're just not going to know what to do with them anymore. So there's this desire to sort of keep people in their place. And I think that's what we're seeing with these peaks and valleys and the bumpy road, and that it's not this smooth, path, but it's fraught with a lot of discontent. It's fraught with a lot of concern, but it's also a path that for many women, they saw it as directional. We're gonna take this particular path, and we may have to do a couple of things that we don't like, but in the end, hopefully we'll have this goal that we've reached. But unfortunately, it did not come very smoothly for those women who did not fit into a particular characterization of womanhood and femininity and who should have the right to vote. And that certainly didn't include women of color, and it certainly didn't include those white women who were poor.
What I can say about this is that many of the folks who do history work caution very strongly against the progress narrative. So there's this narrative of the United States that's like, hey, there's these founding documents, they are visionary, they're revolutionary, they're transformative, they're incredible. And we know that in some ways they certainly were, right? And then people will say the history of the United States is our work to live up to these founding documents. And it's taken some time, but you can see that we're always marching on and forward to really making real what this says, and that history is marching forward all the time, right? And I would really caution against that for any number of reasons, right? Thinking about the massive enslavement of African people and theft and genocide against indigenous people that's at the foundation of all that, just the very beginning of it. But also the idea of this progress narrative can really lull us into thinking like, oh, well, people just figured out eventually that of course women should have the vote. And then women got the vote, right? And we figured, well, of course slavery was wrong. And then we ended slavery. But when you look at these histories, they're deeply complicated, and there's conflict all throughout, and the pushback never ends. Right, so have we seen the pushback on women engaging in the political sphere? Is that all done? Is that all taken care of? Of course not, right? And so I think that have we seen the full realization of the recognition of everyone's complete humanity in the United States? No, that's not where we are. So I think that when we look at all of these histories, really, if you're looking at a history that's presented as we're marching toward justice and the enactment of our ideals as if it's somehow inevitable and it just happens, I would just encourage you to question that and really look for the places of conflict. And Dr. Kimberly Jensen, who's a wonderful historian of women in Oregon and elsewhere, taught me that a long time ago, that you look at these narratives of success and never think it's over. Never think that victory is won forever. So.
I have a project that I've been working on for years. I'll get it done at some point, but it actually has gotten so large. What I decided to do was look at editorial cartoons from a variety of newspapers, mainstream newspapers and the black press during different time periods. And one of the eras that I am looking at is the civil rights era. And it's really interesting to see how editorial cartoons look at the path to the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill. And again, if you're thinking this is this easy thing and oh, it was just so smooth and it was so lovely, well, not really, because there are all kinds of interesting images. I know that there's one that always sticks out in my mind. It's a little black girl who represents the Civil Rights Act, and there is President Kennedy who's trying to walk her across the street, and yet he gets run over. So there are these. So it's what it's trying to do is show you this is not this easy path. There are so many different things that we see in history where there is this narrative that, oh yes, it was smooth. We started here. We ended there. Anybody who's ever been to a meeting knows nothing is ever smooth. You want to vote on one thing, and it seems really simple. It should take 5 minutes. It should not take 5 meetings, but yet it does.
One of the nuanced, smaller sub-stories in the history of suffrage is the ways that we saw folks in power, mostly white men, using women's suffrage as a tool for their own maintenance of power, rather than the power sharing that it appears to be on the surface. So in Montana and Wyoming, who were not widely populated states, they didn't have enough women, and they wanted more representation in Congress. So they were like, cool, vote, come on out, it's gonna be great. And then in Utah, you saw white men being particularly afraid that black men would get the right to vote, and so they sort of did a horse trade around white women getting the right to vote. And they thought that women would come out and vote in large numbers against polygamy. And so when they gave it to them, women came out in large numbers and actually voted for polygamy, which is another whole fascinating scenario. But I'm particularly interested in the ways that suffrage was sort of used to obfuscate or distract or actually maintain power structures, or was seen as the least of all possible evils when you were talking about any type of suffrage or rights gaining. So I'm really interested about that. It seems like such a Trojan horse of like, we're power sharing, JK.
I don't know that I have a response to the question, or that I fully understand the question. I think efforts to dehumanize people, to use people's body for their gain, is a level of violence that we don't talk about. We talk about them in soft language like barriers or soft language like rights, but when we're creating mechanisms to enact violence on human bodies, I feel like we're participating in the same, in the same playbook, if you know what I mean. Like, I think when we take a platform and wield it and don't talk about what that means in terms of cultural genocide and ancestral genocide, and I think we grant too much of a premise in that playbook.
I think we have another few minutes, then we're going to take questions. I'm interested in some of the names. I know folks here who have scratched the surface of suffrage in Oregon likely know Abigail Scott Duniway's name. Who are the other likely under-celebrated, specifically women of color, leaders in Oregon's movement for suffrage? This is for you, Eliza, or anybody else.
Okay. In 1872, I'm really liking this phrase that sovereignty doesn't ask, right? And so I think that it makes me think about the ways that people enact direct action in their protest, which is also a way of not asking, I think. Now I'm worried I'm co-opting that phrase. But when I think about doesn't ask, I'm thinking about women in 1872, including Susan B. Anthony and others who said, look, here's the 15th Amendment. It says citizens have voting rights. We're going to go vote. Right? And so many folks know that Susan B. Anthony was arrested and fined $100 for trying to vote in 1872, and that the Supreme Court eventually said, yeah, you're citizens, but that doesn't mean you get the right to vote. You're special as women, not really fully adult human beings, right? So, but in Oregon in 1872, there were 4 women who engaged in that same direct action. And so they were Abigail Scott Duniway, Maria Hendy, Mrs. Lamb, and then also a woman named Mary Beatty, who is an African-American woman. And so here's a woman in 1872 Oregon. This is 13 years after the Constitution saying no black people could live in the state, was not only living in the state, but was out making herself extremely visible, protesting against the lack of her right to vote. So I think Mary Beatty's amazing, and historian Jean Ward is doing more research on her, so we're all going to know a lot more about Mary Beatty in the coming months, so keep your eye on her. Another woman I would talk about is Dr. Chan, Mrs. S.K. Chan. She formed and led a local Chinese equal suffrage society in Portland. She spoke at an April 1912 luncheon with 150 suffragists in attendance. She talked about Oregon's need to catch up with the states on all 3 sides. California, Idaho, and Washington had all granted women suffrage by that time. And she said, quote, China completing the square. So she was looking across the Pacific, because at the time it appeared that China had recently granted to suffrage to women in Nanking. So here is a Chinese woman in 1912. This is 30 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. She's not only organizing, but she's being very public, and hosted a luncheon for 150 other suffragists that was covered by the newspaper. That's pretty impressive. And then the third one is Hattie Redmond, who maybe more folks know about in part because of the work of historian Jan Dilge and all of the research that she did around the 1912 suffrage centennial here. Hattie Redmond came to Oregon with her parents from Missouri in the late 1800s. Her husband, Emerson Redmond, died in 1907. And during the 1912 campaign, she participated in the Oregon Colored Women's Council and the Portland YWCA. She was president of the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association, and she served on the state central campaign committee for the women's suffrage campaign in 1912. So she was a leader a leader of other black women and then working in coordination with other leaders from other communities. And she registered to vote in April 1913.
That was super impressive.
Thanks to the people who did the actual research.
As I said when I opened, I'm a guest here in Oregon, so I wasn't raised in Oregon history. I've had the privilege of working with the Nine Nations for the past 16 years. And one of the things that we teach about when we were trying to pass Tribal History, Shared History, Senate Bill 13, was to help folks understand that when Hillary Clinton was running for office and people were talking about, oh my gosh, we could potentially have a first woman president. Actually, Dolores Pigsley of the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians has been the president of her nation for longer. And so, again, trying to help us focus on women leaders now and what they have gone through to be the amazing women that they are, I would point out the leader of Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians, Dolores Pigsley, and a leader for the Coquille tribe, Brenda Meade. These women have been leading their nation for a long time, and it's not generally understood by most people who live in Oregon.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, coming to you from the Eco Trust building in Northwest Portland. I'm Emily Evans of the Women's Foundation of Oregon. With us today are Shadiin Garcia, Executive Director of the Educator Advancement Council, Eliza Canty-Jones from the Oregon Historical Society, and Dr. Shirley A. Jackson from the PSU Black Studies Department. And we've been discussing the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And we're now going to open the floor to questions. We'd like to welcome our civic scholars to come to the mic and ask the first question. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. And to those who would like to ask a question at the mic, please identify yourself first and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Hi, my name is Alex Mendoza, and related to mechanisms of like prevention from voting or whatever. Real ID, targeting people based on their citizenship, whether they can travel or not. I feel like it's just quietly creeping up on us, and I don't know what we should do. Any insight on that?
I think that's a terrific question, and I recently read a headline that I really loved about this. They said that in the past, barriers, which is a soft word for the total erasure of humanity and power, were super overt. You can't be in this state. You have to pay this poll tax. You must pass this literacy test. And now they're just slightly more thinly veiled. And they said it will be administrative and clerical. And things will be like, oh, this is just about having stronger ID, or oh, this is just about cleaning up our database, or this is just about making sure that we have the right records of this, that, or the other. And that it's so easy to hide that same level of evil behind these like very, seemingly very administrative or very tactical or very small things that are being used to prevent people to vote.
I think your question was, what do we do? You're doing it. You question it and you recognize that it's proxy for dehumanization. You're doing it.
Hi, my name is Sally Bachman, and I really appreciate a lot of your points. Asian Americans were not allowed to vote if they were first generation after the 19th Amendment was passed. Women who married non-Americans lost their citizenship. Native American women who were married to white men were able to vote, and so on. So I think the structure is implicit and explicit. in our society are complicated. And my question is, which one of the complicated barriers to voting do you think we should be working on first, or is there a sequence that we should be following?
That is such an interesting question to ask because there's so many things swirling in my mind right now, as I'm sure there are for anybody who pays attention to the news, right? What are the ways that our election systems and our access to the power of individual human beings are under deep attack and threat right now, right? So I think when you're asking that, what should we be paying attention to? I think paying attention to citizenship and restrictions on citizenship and denial on citizenship, and potentially even asking the question of why do we have this anyway, right? Climate change is here. Climate refugees are here and will continue to be here. What will be the future of the borders of nation states? What will be the ways that we solve the problems of the next 10, 20, 40, 80 years? And is citizenship the right thing to be thinking about? In the meantime, how do we ensure access to citizenship for people who need it, right? Because that point about no first generation Asian American had access to citizenship until 1952 with the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act, right? So the ways that citizenship can be given and taken away are really, really easy, right? What are the other attacks on voting right now? In 2000, the Supreme Court decided a presidential election, right? That was 20 years ago, and remember that, right? So I think that these questions, and then also, I really appreciate the answer of you're doing it by asking questions and drawing attention to this, because the other thing that we're facing very deeply right now is confusion and exhaustion and cynicism and fear about the system in itself. So shedding light on ways that our electoral systems are under attack, shedding light on the ways that the access to a one person, one vote idea is under attack, paying attention to that, not getting exhausted, continuing to stay involved. I think you asked for one thing and I gave 12, but there we go.
I think that's the answer, right? I think the answer is, and so where I enter is through education. So I studied curriculum theory for 8 years. That's what I got a PhD in. Like, I believe the more we can think about what we put in front of folks to engage in and ask and question, like, what do you lean into? There are 1,000 ways to enter it. Not entering it is a choice, though. And we can't pretend that doing nothing isn't also a choice.
Brenda Brody, City Club member. Thank you for an amazing discussion about the long struggle for all women to get the vote. My question is this: it's 2020, big election year. Women are 51% of the population. How do we motivate and inspire all women to get out to vote this year and not sit on the sidelines, not think that it's not important to vote, and get out there and cast their vote, which we all fought very hard to get over many, many years, as we now know today?
I think that the immediate election is important. Obviously, there's a lot riding on it, and I think that when we focus on get out the vote efforts for an immediate goal, like an election that's within 3, 5, 6 months, we miss the long game. Because these voter suppression efforts, these dehumanizing, these colonization efforts, they've been at it for centuries. In fact, with the current round of administrative voting barriers, they've been playing a 40-year offense. And when we play a 6-month defense for a 40-year offense, it just doesn't stack up. So while I think it's critical that we think about the get out the vote efforts, and I think that's wildly important, I think it becomes a major distraction when we focus on this only on this short game and don't look at the long arm of oppression and disenfranchisement that's prompted such difficulty in the short term. So I think that's not a very satisfying answer. I mean, get out, knock on doors, talk to your friends, work with things in your sphere of influence. There's a lot of incredible places in town and in our state that are doing good work on that. But the moment we get distracted by the immediate, is the moment we've lost the 40-year-long game, in my mind.
I'll add two things. If you are feeling overwhelmed and that's keeping you or people you know from being involved, pick the one thing. Pick the one issue you care about, pick the one campaign you care about, and just focus on that. You don't have to fix everything, just be involved. And then the other thing I would say is read history. Read history books. Because when you read good history books, and there are so many out there, and obviously the Oregon Historical Quarterly, but that gives you that perspective to be able to see that long game, to be able to see the depth of this history, and to be able to understand how difficult it is for power to concede, right? And what that means when power consolidates. You can see those patterns. So pay attention to your elders and read history.
Good afternoon, Lainey Block-Wilker, and thank you all for providing a really important historical context on barriers to access and representation. And my question is, moving forward, looking at voting reforms that could improve access and representation, would your communities be in favor of ranked choice voting, which is the top 4? It would eliminate kind of elitist primaries where a small group picks a winner. And you would have an instant runoff, so it would be less expensive. It would allow more minorities and diverse candidates to win. And I'm wondering if your organizations have an opinion on ranked choice voting.
My organization doesn't have an opinion on one. I think there are lots of mechanical ways that we can improve the process of voting and selection, including ranked choice voting, including having zones of especially smaller municipalities, which having at-large elections for city council and county seats often precludes women and communities of color from running because they're so much more expensive. There are all kinds of administrative ways that we can make it more accessible. I also think that we need to look at the lack of broad civic engagement and the structure around supporting our students to engage meaningfully with real history, and that being the runway to these smaller things around administrative components, making it a lot easier. Because right now we don't equip our communities and our students and our citizens with the capacity to engage with these real questions in the ways that they need to.
And I'll say, just because our organizations don't do this doesn't mean others don't. And so if you are interested in the civic structure of the place where you live, might I suggest joining City Club and becoming involved in a research committee and creating a recommendation through the City Club.
And again, broken record, might I recommend getting to know what the tribal governments in your state look like, how they operate, how they actually manifest sovereignty as they center their own nation and their strengths and their communities.
Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you so much for being here. This is, well, as we all know, we're here, a very, very important series of topics. My question is civics education. I'm delighted to see students from Jefferson High School. We're talking about barriers to voting. We're talking about encouraging voting. What do you recommend about enhancing, improving, uplifting civics education in the state of Oregon?
That was a fast pivot to, again, I'm going to continue to repeat a little bit of what I've said. For those of you who aren't aware, we passed a really important bill called Tribal History, Shared History, Senate Bill 13, that requires K-12 embed contemporary, accurate, place-based knowledge of Indigenous peoples past and today in Oregon. We also passed the Ethnic Studies Bill. We also passed the Holocaust Studies Bill. We also passed, so I believe deeply that the intentional erasure has to be met on all sides through the classroom in ways that we can shift both current teachers, future teachers, educator preparation programs, and in doing so, we can create racially affirming work environments where kids don't experience trauma. If I have to listen to another story of my sons coming home and saying, you would not believe what happened today, you would not believe another thing that happened today, And when we worked to pass tribal history, shared history, I told my sons, this is not going to happen in your lifetime. You're not going to see the curricular content change in your lifetime, but we're going to work on it. We're going to work with community. He came home last Friday and said, Mom, you're not going to believe what happened to me in school today. And I said, I can't take it. I can't do another, I cannot. He said, my teacher, South Eugene High School, introduced the essential understandings of Native Americans in Oregon because a bill was passed, and now we're going to start to learn about the nations here in Oregon. So I believe strongly in civics education in the context of what it means to center First Peoples as a conduit to understand the entirety of the history of the state and the contemporary of the state from a strength-based perspective. Not the so sad, so awful, so beaten, so amazing, so brilliant, so like the contributions, the strength from the folks who've experienced it themselves.
This will be the last question.
Hi, my name is Jada. I'm from Jefferson High School, and I'm sorry, I have really bad anxiety when it comes to talking to crowds. But I was it's not really a question, but I'd like to add to the thing about voting and like how, Muslim Americans and stuff like that, like Arabs, are being banned from coming to the States. And I feel like we're slowly losing our rights to being citizens in America, and we could be losing our voting rights if, the president we currently have stays in office. And not just Muslim Americans, also Mexicans being kicked out of America to just go back to Mexico because we kind of have a racist president. I just would like to hear your opinion on that stuff.
Okay. I will first say thank you very much for standing up and raising this issue. I really appreciate it. And so I would just go back to some of what we've talked about today, right? And the importance of understanding that the history and reality and ongoing experience of the effort to create a society wherein each person in their full humanity has the ability to influence a government that is based in the self-rule of the people, right? That is, in many ways, a noble vision that is worth fighting for. And I think that there are many, many examples in our history of people who've done that, and there are many leaders and people to look to today who are doing that. So pay attention to the people who are advocating dehumanization, but don't only pay attention to them, right? There are other people working too. Yeah. And so look to the people who are fighting for what's right, and listen to the people who are saying, as Shadiin is saying here, right? There are more than one ways to organize a society, and there are nations here in our state, 9 of them, who have other ways of organizing their society as well. Pay attention and learn there too. So there isn't just one way, and we have opportunities to create. I do think we're a species who can do better as a species on the planet, and I do think that we have that in us, and there are more of us who want to do better and have a just and peaceful and productive world than don't, so we can just all do that together.
Thank you all so much for being here today. Our time is up, and we'll have to pause the conversation for now. We're so grateful to everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you to Shadiin Garcia, Eliza Canty-Jones, and Dr. Shirley Jackson for joining us. We are adjourned.